Good afternoon, and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. My name is Michael Hussey. I'm on the Education and Public Programs staff here, and it's my honor to welcome you, but also introduce our speaker today. Also, I want to welcome those of you watching on our YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Before we get to today's program, I'd like to tell you about two upcoming programs that will take place in this theater and again on our YouTube channel. Tomorrow, September 15th at 7 p.m., the National Archives is going to be celebrating Constitution Day with our 10th annual State of the Constitution program, which will focus on the future of policymaking under our current constitutional system against the backdrop of national elections. This will be presented in partnership with the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution at James Madison's Montpelier, and speakers will include Senator Rand Paul and others. On Wednesday, September 21st at noon, author Laura Weinrib will be here to discuss and sign her book, The Taming of Free Speech, America's Civil Liberties Compromise. This program is presented in conjunction with the exhibit Amending America, which is currently on display in our O'Brien Gallery. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, please consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online at archives.gov. There are copies also in the lobby, along with a sign-up sheet so that you can receive it by regular mail. You'll also find brochures about other National Archives programs and activities. Another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports the work of the agency, especially its education and outreach programs. So you can pick up your application for membership in the lobby or become a member online at archivesfoundation.org. Now it's my great privilege to introduce today's speaker. Arthur T. Downey. I had just a wonderful conversation with him in the green room and learned a little bit more about some things that he's written. But let me start from the top. He has taught at Georgetown University Law Center. He's a member of the Bar of the District of Columbia. He lived through the Cold War as a student, a lawyer, a diplomat, and a government official. Perhaps most notably worked for Henry Kissinger in the NSC from 1969 through 1972. He has written some other fascinating books. He's the author of Civil War Lawyers, and he spoke here in the summer of 2015, and I'm sorry I missed the talk, about his book, The Creole Affair. I was just speaking with Mr. Downey shortly before I came up here, and I always have 4 or 5 books that I'm in the middle of reading, and now I'm adding a 6th because it sounds so fascinating, The Creole Affair. After Mr. Downey's talk and question and answer period from you, the audience, he'll be signing copies of his book, one level upstairs outside of the Archives store. So I'd like to, without further ado, welcome Mr. Arthur T. Downey to the stage. Mr. Downey.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. Thank you all very much for coming out on a brutally hot day. Maybe it's the fact that we're going to be talking about the Cold War that induced you here. We're going to be talking narrowly, with respect to the Cold War, about the role of law and lawyers during that period. 125 years ago during the American Civil War, the law and lawyers dominated public discourse because lawyers dominated public discourse at that time. It's no accident that all of Lincoln's cabinet members were lawyers. Jefferson Davis's cabinet members were all lawyers, except Davis, he was a West Pointer. But today, you think we have too many lawyers. We really did then. and we have very few now. So this is a narrow slice of the Cold War, the role of law and lawyers, small but not insignificant. The book deals with lots of aspects of that. What I'll try to focus on this morning is international law and spies, and if we have time, maybe the economic Cold War. First question is, when did this happen? When did the Cold War start? When did it end? Well, let me take you back to the fall of 1945, when Frank McClure was the president of a little college, Westminster College, in Fulton, Missouri. And for some reason, he had the idea, why don't I invite Winston Churchill to come to my college to give a talk next spring? Well, it turns out that Frank McClure, president of Westminster College, was a graduate of Westminster College. And his classmate back then was now President Truman's military aide, General Harry Vaughan. The moral of this story is it's nice to have friends in high places. So President McClure writes a letter to Truman, comes to Washington to see his old friend, General McClure, Harry Vaughan. McClure shows Vaughan the letter, and Vaughan says, let's go in and see the boss. So they walk into the Oval Office. McClure shows President Truman the letter. Truman reads it, takes out his pen, and writes at the bottom to Winston Churchill, as you may know, I am from Missouri. This is a nice little college. If you agree to come, I will introduce you. And that's how it happened. So the following March of 46, President Truman and Winston Churchill and Truman went out by train from Washington to Fulton, Missouri. And the man on the right-hand side is Frank McClure. And in that speech in March of 1946 is when we have the infamous phrase, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended upon the continent. Some say that was the beginning of the Cold War. Or others say 1946. I'm sorry, I should have. There he is. That's him giving the talk. In 1947, some say that's the beginning of the Cold War because we had the Truman Doctrine, which was massive aid to Greece and Turkey, which was poised to topple from communist subversion. Or in June, the Marshall Plan was unveiled by Secretary of State Marshall at a commencement address at Harvard. Others say, no, the Cold War started in 1948 with the Berlin blockade. Well, when did it end? Some say it ended in November of 1989 when the Berlin Wall disintegrated. Others say no, it ended the next year, 1990, when the four powers, the Soviet Union, US, France, and the UK, signed the agreement on the unification of Germany, and massive changes, liberalizations in Eastern Europe. Others say, no, it's the next year, 1991, when the Warsaw Pact was terminated and the USSR ceased to exist. My pick, 1946 with Truman, and 1990. Let's have a little overview to give you the context of the Cold War period, which can be conveniently divided into 5 periods, largely determined by who was in power in Moscow and in Washington at any given time. That drove a lot of the show. The first period might be 1946 to 53. You had just 2 powers. You had Stalin in Moscow and Truman in Washington. Stalin died in 53. During that period, you had the creation of NATO. You had the collapse of Eastern Europe, the takeover of Eastern Europe by the Soviet Union. Mao Zedong took over China in that period. The Soviets exploded their nuclear weapon in 1949. You had East German uprisings in 1953. Wonderful Herblock cartoon. Domestically, we had Senator Joe McCarthy and the Red Scare, that you had a communist under every blanket. Second period, 53 to 62, a long period. But you just had Khrushchev on the one hand and Eisenhower and Kennedy on the other. The first summit meeting ever held was Khrushchev and Eisenhower. That's standing in front of Blair House, where Khrushchev stayed. And that was the first of 23 summit meetings that we held, 3 under Eisenhower, 1 under Kennedy, 1 under Johnson, 3 under Nixon, 2 under Ford, 1 under Carter, 5 under Reagan, and 7 under Bush 1. You see the escalation. But still during this period, you had uprisings in Poland, in Hungary that were crushed. Germany came into NATO. You had the construction of the Berlin Wall. And you had, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Tough time. Third period, you had 62 to 79, another long period. We had 5 American presidents during that time, and only Brezhnev on the other side. We had Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter. We had the Prague Spring, crushed violently by the Warsaw Pact. We had Vietnam, and we had détente, the beginning of détente. That's the Secretary of State on the right, and Nixon and his friend Brezhnev. The fourth period, very dramatic period, 1979 to 85. Many view 1979 as a pivotal year. Think of all the characters who walked on the stage in 1979. Margaret Thatcher fundamentally changed Great Britain and maybe Europe. Deng Xiaoping in China got power and started the change that we see today. Ayatollah Khomeini came to Iran. Pope John Paul II went to Poland. These characters all had enormous influence. And of course, during this period, you had the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and Reagan's arrival. And Reagan was confronted, who was in power in Moscow at that time? Well, you had Andropov, who was the former head of the KGB, and he was infirm and lived only 15 months. He was succeeded by Chernenko, who was also infirm and lived only 13 months. 1983 was, by some lights, the most difficult, hottest, dangerous period of the whole Cold War. This is when you had Reagan announcing the evil empire with high emotion. You had the arrival of Star Wars, which terrified lots of folks. You had the Korean plane shot down by the Soviets. You had the tremendous worry in Europe with the military exercise, NATO military exercise called Able Archer, where there was it was supposed to be a purely an exercise assuming a nuclear strike and advance by the Soviets. And the Soviets misunderstood. They thought it was real. And we were about 20 minutes away from the Soviets launching a preemptive nuclear strike. It's a terrifying moment. If you're interested, there's a wonderful made-for-TV German movie called Deutschland 83, which views that period from the German perspective. It's a wonderful story. Fifth period is 85-91 to the end of the Cold War. It's Gorbachev and Reagan, a little bit of Bush 1 at the end. The Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan at the time. Gorbachev comes in and repudiates the Brezhnev Doctrine. Brezhnev Doctrine was, once a country becomes communist, all the other communist countries have an obligation to ensure that they stay communist, i.e. we'll invade Budapest, we'll invade Prague, and so on. He introduces glasnost and perestroika, political and economic liberalization. In November of 1989, the Berlin Wall begins to crumble. That early evening, a young 35-year-old research chemist from East Berlin climbs, picks her way through the wall, goes into West Berlin to look at the shops, but she's got to get back to East Berlin because she has early work in the morning. That, of course, was Angela Merkel, today the most powerful woman in the world, Chancellor of Germany. Some miles south, in Dresden, the local East German populist is rising up. They enter the Stasi, the East German secret police, the Stasi headquarters, and ransack it. And some of them, scores of them, come to the KGB office there. And a 37-year-old colonel, lieutenant colonel, is out in the backyard burning the codes. And he comes to the front and tells these people, we're armed here. This is Soviet property. If anybody comes further, they'll be shot. That, of course, was Vladimir Putin. There was the KGB officer in Dresden. We don't want to forget the literature of the Cold War. You see so much about a society by their literature. Who can forget 1984 by George Orwell, Ian Fleming's creation of the James Bond series. We still talk about James Bond today. Jean le Carré, whose real name was David Cornwall, a British intelligence officer in Bonn, the spy who came in from the cold, Tinker Tailor soldier spy. Remember Tom Clancy's long series of books, beginning in 1984 with The Hunt for Red October, that was made into a movie in 1990 with Sean Connery playing the lead role and Alec Baldwin. You may remember that movie. That was where the captain of a Soviet missile ship, actually he was a Lithuanian, Ramus, that was the Sean Connery figure. He decided to defect and to bring his submarine to the Americans. His first step in his move to carry out this enormous defection was to take care of the KGB political officer on the ship who would have stopped him. So he shot him. In the Clancy book and in the movie, the name of that KGB officer is Ivan Putin. Amazing. And of course, we can't forget the great Russians. Boris Pasternak in Dr. Zhivago, and Solzhenitsyn, Gulag Archipelago. They both won Nobel Prizes, but were not permitted to go and accept them. So they had to decline them. All right, that's the setting. Now let's pick up one or two elements of international law at first during the Cold War period. We'll talk first about Berlin, which is the iconic symbol of the Cold War and is on the cover of the book. Lenin quoted Marx as saying, "Whoever possesses Berlin possesses Germany, and whoever controls Germany controls Europe." It was really important. At the Yalta Conference in the Crimea in 1945, as World War II was ending, it was decided that the occupation of Germany should be managed by having 4 zones of occupation and separately and distinct 4 sectors within the city of Berlin. And each of the powers would be supreme in their zones and in their sectors in Berlin. There was a governmental organization called the Allied Control Authority, where the Soviets, the French, the Americans, and the Brits ran all of Germany from their zones, and in Berlin, an organization called the Allied Kommandantura, which governed Berlin. However, by 1949, the Soviets left the governing structure of both all of Germany and of Berlin. There were only two entities that they stayed in for the whole Cold War. One was the Berlin Air Safety Center in West Berlin, which controlled the air traffic coming from West Germany in the Berlin air corridors. And so there sat until 1991 Russians, Soviets, Brits, French, and Americans controlling that air traffic. The other organization that they stayed in was Spandau Prison, which was a prison physically located in West Berlin that housed the Nazi war criminals who were tried at Nuremberg. And that was really quite an event, and it was the lawyers, the governmental lawyers of the powers that were the governing management group for Spandau Prison. And here you had in West Berlin, the military security for the prison was controlled by each of the four powers, rotating each month. So each month, the American military would hand off responsibility for the security of the prison to the Soviets. And to see these men lined up, 40 men on each side, in the yard of the prison, and both sides always got the biggest guys they could find, the meanest guys, to hand that off. Every month, whichever government was in charge that month held a lunch at the prison. And these lunches were elaborate. People always wanted to go to the French month because the food was really good. Very few wanted to go to British month for obvious reasons. There were detailed agreements on the prison, how you ran the prison, literally how many calories the prisoners were allowed to receive a day. By the late 1960s, there was only one prisoner left, number 7. Number 7 because they were given numbers in 1945 as they got 46 as they got off the truck from Nuremberg. You're prisoner 1, you're 2, you're 3, and the last prisoner happened to be Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy. You're number 7. And everybody at the prison had to refer to these guys by number only. They were nameless people. And so he was there by the late 60s. He was alone. I happened to be the American lawyer in charge at that point, and with my British and French colleagues, we were concerned about his health. He was not a young man, and he was living in this dank cell, iron bars and stone walls. And we went to the Soviets and said, hey guys, give him some yard time, let him see some sun, just because we have an obligation. He's our prisoner. We have to ensure his health, not that we like him. And they said, no. Finally, after endless negotiation, we worked out a deal. He'll work outside. Soviets said, okay, good socialist thing to do, you work. So we went to Hess and said, now look, here's the deal. You can get outside in the yard, and you can get some sunlight. But you got to hold a hose or hold a rake. You don't have to do much, but just get out there. And he said, no. I am a minister of the Reich, and ministers of the Reich do not do manual labor. I wanted to strangle him at that point. So he stayed there until 1987, when he died, and the prison was demolished because there was worry that it might become a neo-Nazi shrine of some kind. So it was demolished. The lawyers from the 3 western sectors in Berlin had another main function, and that was to review West German legislation applicable to West Berlin. Our legal theory was Berlin is an occupied city. We run it, the Allies. West Germany is a different place, and even though some of the West Germans like to think of West Berlin as part of West Germany, we said that'll undermine our legal position and we can't do it. So every piece of West German legislation that they wanted to be applicable to West Berlin, we would say, no, it can't, but the West Berlin legislature, the local legislature, can adopt identical legislation as Berlin legislation. There were exceptions, of course. For example, since it was an occupied city, none of the military-related legislation of West Germany could be permitted. So there was no draft in Berlin. So lots of German young men moved to Berlin, where they wouldn't be subjected to joining the Bundeswehr. We had then, in 1948, June of 1948, the beginning of the Soviet blockade of Berlin, where rail traffic, road traffic, water traffic was blocked. Their goal was to kill West Berlin, to force the Allies out and to take it over. Berlin is 110 miles from the West German border. But then we had the tremendous Berlin airlift, where amazingly US, British, and French planes flew tons, 10,000 tons, mostly of coal during the winter, into Berlin. A plane landed at Tempelhof Airport every minute. It was just extraordinary. Anyway, the legal position that we had with respect to permitting our aircraft to fly in the Berlin air corridors was essential to maintaining that operation. We had subsequent Berlin crises in 1958 when Khrushchev said, we're going to walk out of Berlin, we're going to turn it over to the East Germans. Berlin is part of East Germany, you're going to have to deal with them. We don't have any more responsibility for access to Berlin, and we had a crisis. President Eisenhower in '59 went on national television, a relatively rare event at the time, and laid out our legal position. He had maps showing the air corridors, etc. And then, June of 1961, President Kennedy has his meeting in Vienna with Khrushchev. They talk about Berlin a lot. And Kennedy, every time he spoke about Berlin, talked about West Berlin. Emphasis West, not all of Berlin. And Khrushchev picked that up. And so by June, he said, Khrushchev said, we're going to throw you guys out. We're going to sign a separate peace treaty. The president brought in former Secretary of State Acheson and others to help. He also brought in Henry Kissinger at that time. You normally think of Kissinger with Nixon, but it was Kennedy who brought him in there. In July, late July, President Kennedy goes on television and spends the whole time talking about our legal rights of access to Berlin. At that point, of course, the Soviets were getting enormous pressure from the East Germans because the East Germans were hemorrhaging talented people, because any East German worth his salt could get to Berlin, to East Berlin, and cross over into West Berlin and make it out. So the East Germans, Communist Party bosses, were saying to the Soviets, you got to do something, guys. We got to stop this. And then, of course, the Berlin Wall went up July 25th. August 13th, when the wall was constructed. And we know then the president, a couple of years later in 63, went to Berlin and delivered his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech, which was really extraordinary. It's worth reading the whole speech. It's beautifully done. And then in '69, as we saw before with Nixon and détente, fitting in with West German Chancellor Willy Brandt, a Berliner himself, worked out in '71, '72, an agreement with the Soviets and the French and the British on Berlin. And as part of that package, we recognized East Germany, the two Germanys entered the United Nations, and the Berlin crises of a quarter of a century were essentially over at that point. Quite a move. And then, of course, you have Reagan in June of '87, who went to Berlin, stood at the Brandenburg Gate, and said, General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the people of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate, Mr. Gorbachev. Open this gate, Mr. Gorbachev. Tear down this wall. And of course, that happened in '89, and the German issue vanished. Let me shift now and talk about international organizations, or we'll take just one, NATO, because it's very relevant today. Interestingly, the first time the concept of an attack on one means an attack on all was created in 1947 in the Inter-American Treaty called the Rio Treaty. The United States had been very worried during World War II about the exposure of Panama and others. And so in this treaty in 1947, Article 3 says, an armed attack by any state against an American state shall be considered an armed attack against all the American states, and each undertakes to assist in meeting that attack. That was a novel concept that Senator Vandenberg, a Republican chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee from Grand Rapids, Michigan, was part of the delegation. He deserves enormous credit because he worked with the Democratic administration to fashion a foreign policy, as he put it famously, partisan politics stops at the water's edge. Wouldn't we like that today? But it was Vandenberg working with Truman and Atchison that pulled off the NATO treaty in 1949. The ultimate goal of the North Atlantic Treaty was to keep the Americans in Europe, keep the Russians out of Europe, and keep the Germans down. The key Article 5, which you'll hear anybody in Eastern Europe today repeat to you verbatim, says, an armed attack against one or more of the parties shall be considered an attack upon them all, and each of them will assist the party so attacked by taking forthwith such actions as it deems necessary. That's the key element in the North Atlantic Treaty. In 1959, Germany was added to NATO. Article 5 has been invoked only once, and I bet you can guess when that was. 15 years ago exactly, September 11th. The September 11th crisis was the only time that Article 5 was invoked. The General Council of NATO, a Belgian citizen, had to make the decision ultimately. First, was this an armed attack from outside, or was this like Columbine? Was this a domestic problem? Once he decided it was that the aircraft were used as missiles, this is an armed attack, and so we can invoke Article 5. NATO has now expanded from 12 members in 1945 to 28 members today. In '99, we added Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. In 2004, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovenia, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania. And 8 years ago, Albania and Croatia. Today, you find some Russians arguing that the advancement to the east of NATO violated the fundamental deal that was worked out for the Russians to agree to the unification of Germany. That the Americans and the others said, if you agree to unify Germany and have Germany enter NATO, NATO won't move to the east. And the Russians say, but that's just what you're doing. You've got American troops in Poland, and on and on and on. It's a flashpoint. It's a very a serious problem. Let's talk briefly about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Tough time. To understand that, you have to go back a year before to March of 1960, when President Eisenhower authorized the training of Cuban exiles in Guatemala for a potential invasion of Cuba. The plan there had them arriving in Cuba along the coast near the mountains, so that if it failed, they could move into the mountains and become guerrillas, just like what Castro did years before. But he never gave the go-ahead for the actual invasion. And of course, in March of '61, we had the Bay of Pigs. It was different. It was done at the Bay of Pigs, which wasn't the right location, and there was no air cover, so it was a total debacle. And as a result, June of '62, a year later, the Soviets and the Cubans got together and decided to install missiles in Cuba. Why? Well, Khrushchev felt that he thought Kennedy was weak, especially after the Berlin Wall went up with no response. So I can snafu him. He was also worried that after the Bay of Pigs mess, Kennedy might go in and invade Cuba. And Khrushchev, was already under pressure from the Chinese for being weak, something else we hear today, for being weak and not being strong enough, and he couldn't afford to have the Americans take over Cuba. Probably most importantly, at that time, the Americans held a 17-1 advantage in strategic missiles. Well, if you move medium-range ballistic missiles into Cuba, you change that balance immediately on the cheap. It's a terrific opportunity. And Khrushchev later joked the other reason he went ahead was because his Dasha was on the Black Sea, and he could see the Jupiter missiles in Turkey across the Black Sea, and he didn't like that. Anyway, we had in October, I missed one, sorry. That was East Germany, yeah. October 1962, we discover the missiles. The president convenes his executive committee, which was taped, all the happenings, which is marvelous. You can read 600 pages of the discussions during the Cuban Missile Crisis by the participants. And of course, naturally, early on, the conversation was, we've got to bomb them immediately, we have to invade, we've got to do it before these missiles become operational or we'll never be able to do it. Let's get in there now. And actually, the lawyers involved played a significant role. You had George Ball, Dean Acheson was brought in, even the president's brother, the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy. And they said, that's really risky because, then the Soviets will take Berlin. We've got that problem. They may go after Turkey. So how about a blockade? Then you had a lot of discussion about blockade. So I'm saying, listen, blockade is an act of war. We can't do that. We're not authorized. The State Department lawyers, Deputy Legal Advisor Len Meeker, then came up with the notion of a quarantine, a defensive quarantine, which is sort of a blockade light. And that's what they ultimately seized on. Kennedy was in direct touch frequently with Prime Minister Macmillan, and Macmillan's main interest here was make sure our international lawyers are talking to your international lawyers and we're agreed with what we need. One of the key players was our former ambassador to Moscow, Llewellyn Thompson, who knew Khrushchev well. And he said, this is hard to believe, but Khrushchev is impressed by legal issues. And if we've got a really good legal basis for this, that'll impress Khrushchev. So in fact, the decision was made, let's go to the Organization of American States, where we'll try to get a 2/3 majority to support us. In fact, that's the Organization of American States unanimously voting to support the United States at the time. And as we know, it all ended, fortunately for everybody concerned. The Soviets withdrew their missiles. The Americans pledged never to invade Cuba, so Khrushchev got what he wanted there, a no invasion pledge. The Soviets promised never to introduce offensive weapons in Cuba, and the Americans agreed to remove their Jupiter missiles in Turkey. That was a side deal worked out with the Attorney General and Ambassador Dobrynin. I'm close to running out of time, and I'm upset with myself for not moving faster, because I wanted to talk very briefly about the one pure international case during the Cold War. It was the United States and Nicaragua. Nicaragua was not the hotbed of the Cold War, but it was a player. In the early 80s, late 70s, the Sandinistas came in, and in the early 80s, the Reagan administration supported the Contras to fight them. The Americans, a few years before, had won a terrific victory at the World Court. Iran had taken over our embassy. We went to the World Court and said what Iran did was a violation of international law. The court agreed. So from US eyes, the World Court was really terrific. They know how to decide things. So during the process with Nicaragua, we were getting tougher when Reagan came in, tougher and tougher and tougher. We invade Grenada. Nobody liked that. And the Nicaraguans early on said, we need an American lawyer, a Washington lawyer, to help us first bring lawsuits all over the United States for all of the property of the state of Nicaragua that the Somoza regime had stolen, ships, planes, sugar, you name it. So they hired an American lawyer, William Rogers, to do that. Rogers handed it off to a young associate, whose name was Paul Reichler, who happened to be a Spanish speaker, and said, you do all that. Well, after a little while, when Reagan came in, the senior partner says, we're not going to represent Nicaragua anymore. It's not politically smart. Sorry about that. So Reichler's presented with a dilemma. Does he stay with his client, or does he stay with the law firm? He was a few years away from becoming partner. He left, went to another firm, kept his client with him. A little while later, he says to his client in Nicaragua, you know, I think we ought to bring a lawsuit against the United States in the World Court. Not that we're going to win, because we can't, because the Americans have this crazy reservation that says we don't have to be bound by anything that deals with anything within our domestic jurisdiction as we determine that. But he said, what I really want to do is change enough votes in the House to stop aid to the Contras. Finally, Nicaragua says, okay, go ahead. So he hires Abe Shays, the former general counsel of the State Department, Harvard law professor, and they bring a lawsuit in the World Court against the United States. Long story is, after all kinds of shenanigans, that's Reichler on the extreme left, and his Nicaraguan, and Abe Shays in the middle. The United States government says, we are not going to participate. We don't think the World Court's really very good. So we walked out. And then later, we actually withdrew our acceptance of jurisdiction. For the first time in 40 years, we've left the World Court, that just a few years ago was really a hot ticket. Anyway, in the end, the court decided 12-3 that the United States action aiding the Contras was a violation of international law. Now, why is this relevant today? What is the hottest international law event this year? Is this decision by the International Court in The Hague dealing with the South China Sea, and whether the Chinese actions there are consistent with international law or not. And that case was brought by a small country, the Philippines, against a superpower, China, just as a small power, Nicaragua, brought a case against the superpower of the United States. And guess who the lawyer is for the Philippines? Paul Reichler, the same Washington lawyer who did that. I think I really have to stop so that we can talk about some questions, and if you have questions, come to the microphones, please. And if you have questions, for example, about the Bridge of Spies, the Spielberg movie that came out last year with Tom Hanks, I'd love to get those questions because I wanted to talk about that. Yes, sir.
Mr. Downey, I'm a college student here in the Washington, D.C. area, and I'm finding your book to be very interesting and meaningful. What my question is what decisions made by a U.S. president and by a Soviet premier do you think particularly impacted the U.S.-Russian relationship after the end of the Cold War? And if so, what do you think those decisions were, and why do you think that they had an impact?
All right, let me be sure I understand. What happened during the Cold War that influenced the current situation?
What decisions made by leaders during the Cold War would you say particularly impacted the U.S.-Russian relationship after the Cold War?
Yeah. Well, probably the German reunification issue that I mentioned, because from the Russian viewpoint today, that's a tough one. Mr. Putin does a lot to stir up agitation over that. And as Putin has been trying to reconstruct a society that had been diminished, a huge empire, and then it was crushed in 1990, 1991, trying to give it strength again, brutally. One of his targets are the Russian-speaking peoples throughout Eastern Europe, most notably in most notably in Ukraine, but in Georgia before that. And I think something like 30% of Estonia today is Russian-speaking. And so there's enormous pressure from the Russians on those countries. From the US view, this is a NATO obligation to protect them. And if you're sitting in Warsaw today or in Vilnius, you need that Western NATO protection. But a lot of that angst sprang from the decisions to unify Germany and not have the unified Germany become neutral, but have it become in Europe. Part of the discussion originally was, well, maybe Germany can be a member of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Maybe the unified Germany can be part of NATO, but no NATO troops in what is now East Germany, and so on and so on. So those decisions made in 1990, I think probably had enormous influence on the pressures we see today. Thank you.
There was an incident, you may deal with it in your book. It was, I believe the year was 1970, and there was a rendezvous of a US naval ship and a Soviet one on the high seas. One of the Soviet sailors was Lithuanian. He tried to desert and was returned to the Soviet ship, and the incident put the US captain in a very hard legal place because on the one hand, as a captain, he couldn't encourage desertion under the circumstances. On the other hand, with the sailor being Lithuanian and the United States never having recognized the absorption of the Baltic republics in 1940, you could make a case that this, if there was any exception to returning a deserter, this would have been the one. The case soon disappeared from public view, and I never found out exactly what happened to the captain of the U.S. ship. I don't know if you are familiar with this case or not.
I am very familiar with that case. I'll show you the tire tracks up my back. And I don't treat it in the book. I'll tell you the story. I was on the NSC staff at the time. And this case, the Lithuanian defector, it was called, was a big political brouhaha. Allegedly the State Department mishandled it. The White House never knew about it. It was a mess. Well, as it happened, one day I called the general counsel of the State Department, whom I knew. Hey, Charlie, what's happening? What are you doing? Doing this, this, this. And we have this Lithuanian thing, whatever it is. It hadn't surfaced then. Okay, Charlie. And let's get back to what we were supposed to be talking about. Then it all blew up. And the State Department said, well, we informed the White House about this. And I was the guy they supposedly informed when in fact I asked them, what are you doing, and so on. And so I called Kissinger and explained this situation. He was out at a dinner and he said, well, go over in my office tonight, I'm at a dinner, go there and write this up for me and I'll discuss it with the president tomorrow. Okay. So I'm sitting at 9 o'clock at night. I'm sitting at Kissinger's desk, working on this, and I hear noise. Who walks in but the president? And 3 Secret Service guys. He said, hi, where's Henry? I said, well, he's at a dinner. Oh, well, I was just out for a walk and saw the light on and thought I'd stop in and say, hello, what are you working on? Oh, oh, nothing. Can't tell you. Anyway, so yes, I am familiar with the case, and it was a blip. It finally went over. It was a political thing, but it was ugly for the poor Lithuanian, no question about it.
Did it hurt the captain's career?
I'm not sure. I think not. Other questions?
Could you talk about Crises, Spies? We were all here for its premiere at the archives. A lot of research was done.
Before it came out publicly.
Yeah.
I was here that night too.
It was a wonderful night.
Yes. The Bridge of Spies, how many of you saw the movie? Yeah, good movie. And there were lots of things, good movie overall. There were things that I felt weren't really handled as they should have been. For example, it was not shown in the film that Jim Donovan, right from the outset, said, I will donate my fees to charity. I won't take a dime for any of this. And that should have been in there, I think. That was an important step. There was no discussion in the film about the appeal to the Supreme Court. And that was really a very important point. He sat down with Rudolf Abel and said, a decision to appeal is a decision I can't make. You have to make this, Mr. Abel, and let me explain why. If we win, it's not likely we're going to win, but we got a good case. If we win, this case would be returned, it'd be retried, and the sentencing judge at that time might decide to execute you. Tough decision. Now that wasn't in the film, and that should have been, I think. I think right at the beginning, it failed to note when Donovan was on his first vacation for a long time, just got off the train with his family in Lake Placid, New York, about to have his vacation when he got the phone call from his partner saying the court just appointed you. So he turned around and came back to Brooklyn to deal with it. That just shows the nobility of his action. And you'll remember for the evening that we were here when Francis Gary Power's son was here and Jim Donovan's granddaughter was here. And somebody, I think I, asked, hey, you know, in the movie, there were shots fired at your house. Was it really that bad? And she said, we didn't live in a house. We lived in the 14th and 15th floor of an apartment building. No, it was grim, but there were no shots given. That was funny. And I wish it had gone on just a bit to show what else Donovan was doing when he was, during 1962, even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, was in Cuba negotiating with Castro for the release of 2,000 Cuban exiles and some Americans. It's an amazing feat. And at the same time, in 1962, he was running for the US Senate from New York, lost to Senator Jake Javits. Good movie otherwise. I have a old friend who's a former KGB colonel, and he told me recently that when he was in Moscow later in the 70s and 80s, one of the people he would go to as a mentor was Rudolf Abel, because he really understood the Americans well from inside the jail, perhaps. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Are we still in a Cold War?
We are in a lukewarm war. The Cold War is, I think, fundamentally different from what we're experiencing now. The Cold War was global and ideological. It was one ideology against the other. And whether you were in Vietnam or in Nicaragua or in Hungary, it was a massive ideological battle that touched all edges. Today, we're really in more of a 19th century state conflict, where you have a former empire wanting to expand. And how you can, all the actions are kind of classic empire building, state war activities with an overlay of cyber activities and modern warfare, but it's really not ideological anymore. I mean, how often do you hear any kind of an ideological discussion? You really don't. That their system's better than our system, or our system's better. There's no conflict in third countries as we had before. But it's not a good time. It's an extremely dangerous time, I think, because the weapons are worse. Our controls are very difficult, and we don't have people like Senator Vandenberg, who says partisan politics stops at the water's edge. We're too divided, and that's dangerous when the other sides, whether it's in Beijing or in Moscow, are not divided. Any other questions? I think it's 1 o'clock. So thank you. If you have any more questions, I'll be here, and then outside, please let me know. Thank you for your attention.